Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio Podcast, the Geek Therapy Radio Podcast. I'm, of course, your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. Did you enjoy the last episode of Geek Therapy Radio with my friend Dave, living in Japan, who is from New Zealand? I felt that it was one of the best shows that I've done in a while. I enjoyed it thoroughly. That said, just because I think it's the best show or had such a great time doing it, that doesn't necessarily mean that you enjoyed the show. And it doesn't have to mean that. I'm perfectly fine with if I do shows that I don't feel great about, that you really, really enjoy. And also vice versa. I am perfectly fine with doing shows that I love that you didn't particularly care for. It's all good. It all evens out in the end. As long as you like Geek Therapy Radio overall, that's all that really matters as far as the audience is concerned. And I love having each and every one of you listen to Geek Therapy Radio. But let me know what you thought about the last episode. Let me know what you think about this episode. Geek Therapy, of course, the email plug, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. Also, a great way to get in touch with me is just geektherapyradio.com. There's contact information and everything there. Just geektherapyradio.com. You can also find out information about how to support me on Patreon if you feel so inclined to do so. There are some perks for Patreon members. As I'm recording it right now, I need to hop over there and see what shout-outs I need to make. But what you get when you support me on Patreon is, by and large, it's access to extended length interviews. So most of the time when I do interviews, like if I interview Clint from Lazy Game Reviews or Dave, who is living in Japan, I have to whittle them down for broadcast. So broadcast means I only have 39 minutes total to work with. That's total. That's not even counting bump music. That's not even counting all the other kind of setup that I have to do in and out of segments. So the interviews have to be whittled down as much as possible to fit within the 39 minutes total runtime. But the interviews I do, we talk about all sorts of geeky things, usually for well over an hour. And it was no different with Dave. It was no different with Clint from Lazy Game Reviews. So if you support on Patreon, you'll have access to the full unedited. And what I mean by full unedited is you'll hear the mistakes. You'll hear me saying check 1 2 and getting levels. It's really, really behind the scenes stuff. Unless the person I'm interviewing, we get into something personal. There's personal details or anything about addresses or anything kind of like that. I'll cut that stuff out for safety's sake and for privacy's sake. But as far as the conversation goes, it's all there. In the behind the scenes stuff, me setting levels for microphones if necessary. It is the best, most raw look behind the scenes here at Geek Therapy Radio you can get. So that's available to all my patrons on Patreon. Let's click over here because I have to do a couple of shout outs. That's one thing that I like about Patreon is it lets me know what I still need to do. So let's see here. I would like to give a shout out to Jonathan K. Thank you so much. You've been a supporter for a while now, a supporter of Geek Therapy Radio. That is. So thank you so much for your patronage on Patreon. Jonathan, thank you so much from the bottom of my geek heart. That means the world to me. Also, yes, Mike C. Thank you so much for your donation as well. It still baffles my mind that people would support me in such a way out of your own pocket like this. So I never want it to be lost, and I'm never going to ever take it for granted that I have your patronage on Patreon. Even whether it's $2 or $5, it doesn't matter. Whatever you're giving me, even if it's 50 cents, 25 cents, I appreciate it all. And remember that at least 10% of it goes to mental health research and mental health organizations. So thank you so much for that. So that's the shout outs. Thank you very much, Mike and Jonathan, for being the newest patrons over there on Patreon. Last plugs before we move on to Xbox Series X news. Of course, is Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook, Geek Therapy Radio on Instagram, Geek Therapy Radio on YouTube, Geek Therapy Radio. Wait, Geek Therapy Radio on Twitter. That's so silly. Twitter's a really good place to get at me instantly. Get it? At me? Okay, I'm stupid. But yeah, Twitter's a great way. Twitter, by and large, for the most part, is just a cesspool. I don't advise anyone to get on. I don't have a personal Twitter account. I couldn't dream of any world or reality where I would ever get a personal Twitter account. But for staying in touch with hosts and content creators and different kind of, I'm not a celebrity, but celebrities and things like that, it's a good way to get some instant communication. They may not always respond. I usually respond to everything that I get. Granted, I don't have 300,000 followers or anything like that. That's not really what it's about. It's just there and it's available to my listeners should they want to get in touch with me more quickly. If they have a Twitter account themselves. So just type in Geek Therapy Radio on Twitter. I think technically it's at Geek Therapy KPRC. There's a character limit on Twitter. So just type in Geek Therapy Radio on Twitter and it'll come up. Thank you so much. Share the podcast too with your friends if you like it. If you like the show here, if you like Geek Therapy Radio, I'd appreciate you telling your friends and family about Geek Therapy Radio. If you think they'll like it, tell them to look out for the red and white and black color scheme. There's another, I don't try to bring this up too much, but there's another network called GT Radio. That's not me. It's called like the Geek Therapy Network or something like that, and their colors are green, heavily around green and black or something like that. That's not me. I carefully chose my color scheme because it's my favorite colors. Red and black color scheme is my favorite color. So if you type in Geek Therapy Radio and you're searching for Geek Therapy Radio, telling your friends about it, what to look for some variation of red, black, or white, or the combination of all three. So those are the kind of nuts and bolts I can get to in the podcast when I'm not constrained by time and formats and broadcasts and all that kind of good stuff. Also, because when I have subjects that I'm going to get to, for instance, Xbox Series X, we're going to talk about here in more detail, quite a bit of detail. Well, not too much detail, everything you need to know. We'll have that discussion. I timestamp the stuff. So if I run on like I've been doing right now, going through some housekeeping and some behind the scenes stuff, it's at 7.5 minutes or so now, if not longer with the bump, probably closer to 8 minutes now. I put the timestamps always in the title or in the description so everyone knows if they want to skip all this preamble, know exactly when I get to the meat and potatoes. I could talk for an hour here about nothing and then get to the meat and potatoes. But it's always timestamped. I was watching, and I'm going to run on now because this is what we do on Geek Therapy Radio. I was watching the new Marc Maron Netflix stand-up comedy special. That was a long sentence. The other night, and I like Marc Maron. I love Marc Maron. I listen to his podcast fairly regularly, and I don't like critiquing or criticizing other people's podcasts because God knows I do the same thing, and there's plenty for people to pick apart and critique about what I do. There's always something to criticize about other people's artwork and everything like that. So I know that I'm open to it, so I'm susceptible of it. I deserve it, for one way or the other. But Marc Maron, as much as I love his podcast, he'll go on for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, just talking about whatever. He'll put in the title, the guest on the show that day, but it will be 30 or 40 minutes before you get to the guest, and you don't know exactly when he gets to the guest. So in listening to his stuff, it just gave me the idea, man, I wish there were podcasts that when they have the meat and potato subject or they have a guest on, that somewhere clearly visible, they have the exact timestamp of when they get to the meat and potatoes or the guest, or maybe their guest is a sack of meat and potatoes. I don't care. So it's kind of a convenience to you, the listener, that I do put the timestamps for the specific topic that I put in the titles. Not enough podcasts, I think, do that. And I understand why they do that. They want you to listen through all the preamble. They want you to hear about all the plugs that they're doing. They want to hear all the ads and everything like that. And there is fast forward function on podcasts, and you can double the playback speed to 2x or whatever. You can keep hitting the fast forward 30 seconds little thing there. But I just try to put the time right there. It's going to say Xbox Series X, parentheses, at the timestamp that I started talking about. There's people that have a lot to do. They listen to a lot of podcasts. They have a lot to get through. So if they don't want to listen to me just ramble on now for 10 or 11 minutes, they can just go boop, bring the slider right to where I'm talking about Xbox Series X, which in this particular podcast is right now. Let's talk about the Microsoft Xbox Series X. Part of this is really gonna suck because I'm going to talk about the other models of Mexbox. Mexbox just made me think of something so funny. Oh gosh, I don't want to get derailed with what a Mexbox could possibly be. Oh lordy. Okay, but it's going to get kind of sucky because I'm going to say Xbox Series X, Xbox One X, Xbox One S, and all the combinations thereof. And please bear with me as we wade through this water of terrible Microsoft Xbox nomenclature. So I think we're going to start out with the specs of the Xbox Series X, and we'll let the conversation naturally evolve from there. And by conversation, I mean I'm going to tell you stuff, and you can either email me or tweet at me or whatever what you think about what I said, which is perfectly fine, and I love you for it. So let's start with the actual specs of the Xbox Series X. Okay, CPU is the 8-core Zen 2 AMD processor that can cruise all day long at up to 3.8 gigahertz. And by up to, I mean if it needs to run 24 hours a day at 3.8 gigahertz for whatever reason, you just never shut it off and you're at a very particularly scenery intense part of a game, it can cruise along at 3.8 gigahertz, 3.6 gigahertz with SMT. The GPU is 12 teraflops, 52 compute units at 1825 megahertz or 1.825 gigahertz, and it's the new custom AMD RDNA 2 chipset there. There's no, okay, we'll get into kind of how much more powerful that is than previous generations of Xbox, but right now, again, we're just going through the specs here. The die size, well, I'm not going to go over die size. Okay, die size 360.45 millimeters squared, processes the TSMC 7 nanometers enhanced process, so that's AMD 7 nanometers enhanced architecture. Memory is 16 gigabytes of GDDR6. 16 gigabytes of GDDR6. Wonderful. The memory bandwidth, it says 10 gigabytes. Oh, okay, this is what it means. So it's split. There's 16 gigabytes of GDDR6, but it's split. So 10 gigabytes of it, the memory bandwidth is 560 gigabytes per second. 6 gigabytes of it is at just 336 gigabytes per second. So even at its slowest, it's blazing fast memory. Although that said, the Xbox One X, its GDDR5 ran at 326 gigabytes per second. So the Series X is at 336 gigabytes per second at its slowest. So there's not much difference there as far as the quote-unquote slow memory is concerned. But 10 gigabytes of the 16 gigabytes is at a quite a bit faster 560 gigabytes per second. That's huge, and we'll get onto all this stuff, why all these facts and figures are huge momentarily. Internal storage, possibly one of the most important aspects of what makes the Xbox Series X so powerful is its 1 terabyte of custom NVMe SSD storage. It's about 2.4 gigabytes per second. I'm going to assume, it doesn't say, I'm going to assume that's read speed. That may be read and write. I don't know. I don't have all the information in front of me, but the throughput on the NVMe SSD is 2.4 gigabytes per second. I'm just going to assume that's read. It could be read and write, but I don't have the information in front of me. If you do have that information in front of you as far as the actual read and write speeds, again, we're just assuming that it's 2.4 gigabytes per second of read speed, which is the important thing. Don't get me wrong. That's the important thing with a gaming console like this, is how fast it reads from the flash memory to feed the RAM, to feed the system on chip, to feed the CPU, to feed the graphics and everything like that. So that 2.4 gigabytes per second, it's definitely read speed, at least. I'm just wondering if the write speed is equivalent or probably a little lower. Typically, in NVMe drives or any sort of solid-state drive, typically the write speed is at least a little bit lower than the read speed. Either way, 2.4 gigabytes per second in a console of NVMe, custom NVMe memory, 1 terabyte of it, that is mega. That is mega, mega, mega. It has expandable storage that kind of looks like memory cards, and this is crazy. We'll talk about this for a second. They look like memory cards from PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2. You remember what those look like? Those just, I don't know, a couple of square inches or so. But instead of holding, 4 megabytes of save data, 16 megabytes if you were a baller, 32 megabytes if you were just a rich kid in your neighborhood, these new expansion cards are roughly the same size. They look very similar. It's 1 terabyte. It's not just for game saves and things. It's for expanding storage. Yes, you will still be able to expand storage also over USB. In this case, it's USB 3.2. If you have Xbox 360 games or Xbox One games already on an external solid-state drive, 2.5-inch solid-state drive, or 3.5-inch external hard drive, 2.5-inch external hard drive, whatever you have your game saved on from previous generations of Xbox, you can still plug it into the Xbox Series X over USB 3.2. And your whole library is just there. Don't gloss over that fact, what I just mentioned. That is huge, that you don't have to re-download your entire library of games if you already have a substantial library on Xbox One S, on Xbox One X. It's getting confusing again, but you have all these, it's backwards compatible, and you don't need to re-download everything to that 1 terabyte of internal memory. If you have a hard drive, a traditional, optical hard drive that you had for a few years, and you just accumulated, a terabyte or 2 terabytes of a game library and other whatnots, videos and movies and all sorts of things, just plug that into the Xbox Series X. It will all work. And we'll get into this a little bit more later. Let's say you have an Xbox One S game. There are so many awesome features of the Xbox Series X that in a lot of games, if not all of them, you can add HDR. It's kind of like synthetic HDR. I probably would never use this personally because I don't like synthetic anything. It's kind of like when I use cassette tapes. I don't like using... That was way off the wall. But I don't like using noise reduction on cassette tapes. I don't like synthetic kind of whatever, but you do have the choice. If you have an Xbox One S game that you're playing on an Xbox Series X, you can enable high dynamic range. So it kind of breathes a new life to old Xbox games. There's all sorts of other features and enhancements that the Xbox Series X can bring to older Xbox games. Okay, moving on. Optical drive, 4K UHD Blu-ray drive. That hasn't changed since the Xbox One S. It's still the same 4K Blu-ray drive. Here's where things start to get interesting here. It's the performance target. So let's go back to the Xbox One S. The performance target of the Xbox One S was 1080p at 30 frames per second up to 60 frames per second. And I know a lot of us PC Master Race gamers out there are just barfing. 1080p at 30, that was a huge argument as to the superiority of PC gaming over console gaming. It's that consoles were always a bit behind PC. At best, consoles would be as good at PCs, but then since they weren't modular and you couldn't upgrade them, they would fall behind. Within 6 months, they'd be obsolete graphically and hardware-wise to PCs because you could just upgrade components. Oh, graphics got better? Upgrade a better graphics card on my PC. Oh, storage got better? Upgrade storage. Oh, I need more RAM for this game? Just get more RAM. Consoles couldn't do that. So the Xbox One S target performance was 1080p at 30 frames per second up to 60 frames per second. You were lucky if you were to play a game at 1080p 60 frames per second on an Xbox One S. Moving up to the Xbox One X, I hate these names. The Xbox One X performance target was 4K at 30 frames per second up to 60 frames per second. And you'd be lucky on an Xbox One X to get 4K at 60 frames per second. There was different methods to this. They could upsample and whatever to try to achieve 4K, upscale 1080p games to 4K and vice versa, and try to bump it up to 4K at 60 frames per second. That was quite lofty for the Xbox One X. But moving on to the Xbox Series X, the performance target is 4K at 60 frames per second, up to 120 frames per second. So performance target for the Xbox Series X, 4K at 60 FPS, up to 4K at 120 FPS. So the bare minimum starting point, that's the key takeaway here on the Xbox Series X, and it's kind of important. It's critical here. Especially, you got to remember, we're talking about console gaming. The minimum target is 4K, true 4K at 60 frames per second. Let that sink in a little bit there. We're talking about a console. Right now, in the year 2020, a few months before the Xbox Series X is set to launch, we expect it to launch near the end or the last quarter of 2020, I would imagine, before the holiday season. At best right now, gaming PCs are measured by whether or not they can game at a smooth 4K 60 frames per second. The most powerful gaming PCs right now are ranked by how well they can run 4K at 60 frames per second, and it's a challenge to do that. The minimum card you need right now, well, it depends on the game and graphic settings, but popularly right now, the minimum card for 4K, for a smooth 4K 60 frames per second of AAA titles, is the GTX 1080. Not the RTX 2080. That'll do it as well. It'll do it better, obviously. But the minimum card right now, all things considered, for smooth AAA title, flagship games, 4K 60 frames per second, is the GTX 1080. The GTX 1080, you will be lucky to find for less than $400. As of recording, I've been going around Amazon, looking around. I've seen them. I saw one on Amazon for $375. Perhaps you can find one cheaper on eBay if you want to risk dealing with an eBay seller. But we can all agree right now, 2020, as of recording, to play 4K games at a smooth 60 frames per second, it's popularly agreed that the GTX 1080 is the card to get, and it is around $400, even used. That brings me to this point of price. I haven't mentioned price. And if you disagree, real quick, if you disagree with that statement, if you can think of a better graphics card that's cheaper, this is the type of debate that can go on between PC gamers forever. These are the type of threads that you see on Reddit, the type of threads that you see in various PC gaming forums around the internet that just go forever. Quote, what is the best graphics cards for 4K gaming? Because there's so many variables. For instance, you could play Rocket League at 4K 60 frames per second by adjusting the settings down or up to taste. If you had I could do it with a GTX 1060. You could probably do it with I can definitely do it with a GTX 980 if I pick and choose what kind of graphics settings that I want. Because an esports title like Rocket League isn't that difficult to play. It's something else entirely when you're talking about Doom Eternal. I wanted to fit that plug in there. Doom Eternal has come out. If you want to play Doom Eternal 4K 60 frames per second, it's just probably not happening, especially with all the settings cranked up. It's not happening on anything less than a GTX 1080 or a RX. What's the 590-ish? Don't quote me directly on what the AMD equivalent would be. But you need a beefy graphics card, and the point I'm getting across here is you need a graphics card. I think we can all agree on this. That's going to cost a few $100s for smooth 4K 60 frames per second of AAA titles. Think Doom Eternal 4K 60 frames per second. You're going to have to spend at least a few $100s on a graphics card, arguably between at least. Man, I'm going to lowball $250 to $400. That is absolute lowball. An average is probably more around $350, $400 or so to play 4K 60 frames per second in a modern flagship title. $300 to $400 or so. We don't know. That's all that to say this. I'm sorry, I clear my throat. I don't have coronavirus. That I know of. We don't know the price specifically yet of the Xbox Series X, but most popular speculation and most agreement is had around the ballpark of $500. Sony says, Microsoft, it's costing them about between $450, $500 on their end to produce the Xbox Series X, to build it on their end. Some speculate that $600 for the consumer price isn't out of the question. Most people tend to lean towards $500. $500 is a nice middle number. $600, you're edging closer. You're leaning more towards $1,000. It becomes way more of a boutique thing when you get $600. PlayStation 3 was $600 when it came out. Yes. PlayStation 4 was, what was PlayStation 4? $500. Let me double check. I'm sorry, it was $400. But it's different now. You have inflation. You have inarguably much better hardware going into the Xbox Series X and assumably the PlayStation 5 whenever it comes out. So I doubt PlayStation, Sony and Microsoft would be taking a significant loss if they launched the PS5 and Xbox Series X at $400 like the PS4 launched at, especially when both companies are saying they can't build them for much less than $500 on their end. But when sales are concerned and making up the money on the other end through software sales and other different aspects of making money, I think we can mostly agree. You're free to disagree, of course, but I think we can mostly agree that the Xbox Series X, if it comes out for more than $500, we would be genuinely surprised. If it came out for less than $500, we would be delightfully surprised. But $500 for the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5. But let's stick with the Xbox Series X. $500 is most likely. If I was going to bet in Vegas, $500 would be the mark. Go back to that GTX 1080 for 4K. Remember, the Xbox Series X, the target is 4K 60 frames per second. That's the minimum target for their games, is 4K 60 frames per second. And we think it's going to cost $500. To get just the graphics card, let's say you wanted to build an equivalent PC, a gaming PC, that the spec was 4K 60 frames per second, you would arguably need that GTX 1080 for around $300 to $400 right there. How much more of that PC are you going to build to keep it at the price of an Xbox Series X, to keep it around $500? You're talking about a motherboard. Maybe you can get away with $50 on the motherboard. Then you're talking about storage. Then you're talking about RAM. There's so much more. It is almost impossible, if not impossible, to build a gaming PC that can game at 4K, 60 frames per second, AAA titles for less than $500. So, forgive the pun here, but the Xbox Series X, if it's to launch at $500, which everyone speculates it will, and its target is 4K 60 frames per second, that's 4K 60 frames per second gaming for $500. Yes, I know I'm discounting the cost of games itself, $60, but it's the same. That's the same factor on the PC side as well. When people build PCs and they give a budget for building the PCs, they're not counting things like software titles in your Steam account and things like that. It's just we're talking hardware here. So hardware, 4K gaming, 60 frames per second, Xbox Series X, $500. To build the equivalent PC that can game at 4K 60 frames per second in AAA titles, it's going to be way, way more than $500, especially considering what I've talked about previously on Geek Therapy Radio is that coronavirus, COVID-19, is going to affect the supply chains of chip manufacturers, of hardware component manufacturers, all of that. So the price of RAM is going to go up. The price of solid-state memory is going to go up. The price of everything is going to go up. How much it's going to go up, that's to be seen, but it is going to go up. Increased demand on solid-state storage I've talked about in the past. So everything, all the price of everything, building a PC in 2020 is going to amount, it's not going to be as good as it was in 2019. We might be going into a kind of a PC building recession here. So if the Xbox Series X comes out $500, 4K gaming, 60 frames per second. That means at least for a brief moment in time, at least for just a brief moment, consoles will be, this is going to draw some heat if I say this, just as powerful, if not better, than gaming PCs definitely at the $500 budget point. That's just the truth, right? At least for a brief shining moment in time, it will be impossible to game at 4K 60 frames per second in AAA titles for less than the cost of an Xbox Series X. Of course, the same thing will happen as happened in previous generations of consoles. NVIDIA will come out with a new GPU. The RAM standard might change again. Who knows what's going to change? AMD might come out with better graphics cards. I mean, undoubtedly they will in the life cycle of the Xbox Series X. But for a few months, several months, you will not be able to game at 4K 60 frames per second at a better price point than the Xbox Series X for around $500. Even if it's $600, it's going to be the same story. Very, very interesting. So I want to talk about some other improvements that's, happening with the Xbox Series X. Latency. So input lag is a critical point here. They basically lifted as many bottlenecks as possible. And they're saying that for the new Xbox Series X controller, which, by the way, the Series X controller is minimally different from the old Xbox controllers. Xbox One S controller. I have a couple of those laying around. Matter of fact, the Xbox Series X controller will be backwards compatible with Xbox One S, Xbox One X, and everything like that, and vice versa. You can play Xbox One S. You can use the Xbox One S controller on the Xbox Series X. So that's cool that the controllers are so... Is ambidextrous the right word? Ambiguous. They're backwards compatible and forwards compatible. So no matter if you have a modern Xbox controller, you can use it with the Xbox Series X and vice versa. Series X controllers working on older hardware as well. But the great thing here, the improvement here, without getting into too much technical detail, is that the new Xbox Series X controller use what Microsoft is calling dynamic latency input. And basically what it all boils down to is that you'll have a few extra milliseconds of response time. Basically, in a nutshell, it's the way the system communicates with the controller, and it's going to allow game developers to take that into account when making their games, especially for Twitch shooters like Doom I just mentioned, and esports and fighting games. You're going to have a few extra milliseconds of reduced latency. This goes back to the performance targets. It says 4K 60 frames per second up to 120 frames per second. So if you're playing a game and your TV supports this at 120 hertz, the input lag on the controller starts to really matter then, and the input lag is going to be more than adequate. Isn't even the right word. It's going to be more than sufficient for playing at 120 hertz. The fact is, most gamers won't notice that improvement in input latency, but it will be there. And expert players of fighting games and Twitch-based shooters will definitely appreciate the benefit, the decreased latency when playing at, say, 60 hertz or even up to 120 hertz. So that if you're using the Xbox Series X controller, now that I've said that, if you're using the Xbox Series X controller on the Xbox One X or Xbox One S, obviously it's not going to have the same type of latency improvement. It's going to default back to Xbox One and Xbox One X's default protocol as far as controller and joystick input is concerned. I was reading here that for the Xbox One controllers, Xbox One S controllers, it was sampling inputs from the controller. The system was sampling inputs from the controller every 8 milliseconds. It was just basically checking with the controller every 8 milliseconds. Where's the thumbstick at? Where are our buttons at? Checking every 8 milliseconds. So now, rather than having that kind of steady every 8 milliseconds, querying the controller, see where it's at, the system is just going to basically, in what Xbox and what Microsoft is calling, quote, just in time, type of latency that happens each frame or pre-frame. I don't know. Please don't. I am not an engineer. I'm not a developer. I don't know exactly precisely how it works, other than Microsoft says that it will improve latency by a few milliseconds. And Microsoft is calling it dynamic latency input system. Input lag is going to be reduced, especially if you're lucky enough and a game is compatible with playing at 120 hertz. Okay, so one of the last points I wanted to make here, and there's a lot. I'm going over the big hit points here for you here in the podcast. Otherwise, I'm going to be talking for, I'm probably going to approach an hour for this podcast anyways, but there's so much improvement, so much technology happening in the background. Ray tracing, I haven't even touched on ray tracing. The GPU in the Xbox Series X is going to have ray tracing at the hardware level. So I was watching what is it? I've had him on the show before, Austin Evans, doing a demonstration of a tech demo of Minecraft where he could turn ray tracing on and off. And I'm sure a lot of you listening have probably already seen that video. It hits 2.2 million views in like the last less than 24 hours or so. It's crazy. But ray tracing built into the system at the hardware level. It's not synthesized ray tracing, it's actual ray tracing. And it looks really, really cool. So speaking of graphics, one of the things that's going to make the Series X a game changer as far as consoles are concerned, pun intended, is that speed of the memory. Not only the speed of the memory improvements, remember it was 10 gigabytes of the system, GDDR6 memory was going to operate at 560 gigabytes per second. Let me scroll back up. Yeah, 560 gigabytes per second. The I/O, the I/O of the system is, where did I look at that? Yeah, the overall I/O of the system is 2.4 gigabytes per second. On the Xbox One X, it was 120 megabytes per second. Going back further, even on the One S, it was 120 megabytes per second. So One S, I/O throughput was 120 megabytes per second. Xbox One X, same. I/O throughput 120 megabytes per second. On the Xbox Series X, I/O throughput 2.4 gigabytes per second, 4.8 gigabytes per second compressed. That type of, let's call it instant access between the RAM, both the system RAM and the video RAM, and the NVMe solid state drive, that type of instant throughput and massive bandwidth of memory being switched back and forth through all the different components is going to absolutely just unleash the power that developers have at their disposal. Here, and one of the most critical ways is obviously going to be level loading times. So one of the tricks they used to use back in the day, which wasn't too long ago, but let's think about Portal. Most of us have played Portal or any game where there's like this in between the two levels, where you're in this small kind of confined space for a few seconds or maybe a minute or maybe less than 30 seconds, 35 seconds or so. So in the game Portal, every time you finished a level in Portal, you walk into the elevator and you're in this tiny little cylindrical elevator. It's extremely simple for the graphics card in the system to draw that, to render that elevator while you're moving, and it simulates the moving. You're kind of rocking back and forth. The lights are kind of moving on the wall or whatever. But really what was happening in the background, outside of that elevator, so to speak, was the system was trading memory around, is taking memory off of your hard disk, loading it into RAM, and doing everything with the video memory. So that elevator was basically to hide what's going on in the background of the new level loading. Developers don't have to rely on the quote-unquote elevator trick anymore. Access to all the memory, both the storage and the RAM, is so fast now, so instantaneous now, that the action from level to level, it can all be a continuous experience. So if you're playing, the new Gears of War or whatever game you're playing, there is no more kind of elevator. It's not going to rely so much at all on the elevator, quote unquote, technique. It's just the world is going to unfurl before you. This makes me think also of Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. This is probably a similar we all know that Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 is also coming to the Xbox Series X. You don't have to, when you're looking out toward the horizon and you're seeing things kind of render, the draw distance. Remember the draw distance on PlayStation 1 or even PlayStation 2, how it would basically simulate fog on the edges because the system could not draw the level out that far to the horizon. That's not an issue with the Xbox Series X now. The whole thing is just going to be there. Everything up to the horizon that your eye can see, that the pixels can depict, is going to be drawn virtually in real time. There's going to be no kind of waiting and watching things pop into existence as in the past, because the memory and the throughput in the I/O is so monstrously more powerful and so monstrously faster than previous generations of Xbox consoles. Remember, we were talking about 120 megabytes per second on the previous generations. Now we've jumped to 2.4 gigabytes. How many multitudes, how much exponentially faster is that than previous generations? It was something like 40 times or something like that. It's massive. It is a massive leap. So the Xbox Series X is going to be the most powerful console. We're still going to see what PlayStation 5 has up their sleeve. I imagine it's going to be tit for tat, toe to toe going here. But consoles have gotten so incredibly powerful that right now it's hard to imagine building a PC that's similarly capable at the same price point. The same price point. That's what's so huge about this. Is there anything else to bring up? I'm sure there's a lot of stuff we could talk about here with the Xbox Series X, but those are the big hitters. Those are the big, absolute biggest things you need to know. I could talk about the hardware, the cooling situation. It looks like there's a main motherboard and a daughter board on the side. Main board and daughter board, is that a term that people even still use anymore to describe PC hardware components? It's basically cracking the motherboard in half and putting it in a different part of the system. Roughly, daughter boards can be anything. Daughter boards can be modems. Daughter boards could have been video cards. Daughter boards could be anything. But we've seen the form factor of the Xbox Series X. That is how it's going to look out in the wild. So to fit all that in there, it's kind of like a square. To me, it reminds me of a square trash can Mac. Remember the Mac Pro 2013? I think Mac Pro, they called it the trash can because it looked like a little tiny bathroom trash can. The Xbox Series X reminds me of that, except it's obviously brick-shaped. It's rectangular. But it looks really cool. I'll include a link down to the Ars article, obviously, in the podcast, as I am wont to do. I always link the pertinent information, pertinent articles in these podcasts, so you can have a look through it yourself. So I guess the final question here, to wrap this up, the elephant in the room is, would I spend, we'll start with me, and then I'll pose the question to you, but would I spend $500 on an Xbox Series X? For me, it all boils down to this. Yes, I want an Xbox Series X. I would love to have an Xbox Series X. It's basically just going to boil down to, could I afford just to throw $500 at a new console? And I think that's what it's going to boil down to for a lot of gamers out there. So I pose the question to you. If you had $500 just to throw around, or if you're going to save up $500, are you interested in the Xbox Series X? Me personally, I am very interested in the Xbox Series X. Will I actually buy one? I don't know. I don't know. For a lot of us, I have to mention this, we're still waiting to see what the PS5 can do and the price point of the PlayStation 5. There's no word that I'm aware of now yet of when PS5 is going to do its official release to the public of specs and let content creators and reviewers have access to the PlayStation 5 the way Xbox Series X has recently done, or the way Microsoft has recently done with the Xbox Series X. I told you it was going to get muddy with all these names. So I think that's a safe point is we're going to wait and see. Do we want Xbox Series X or do we want PlayStation 5? We have to wait for PlayStation 5 now to drop the ball. We have to wait for Sony to drop the ball on the PlayStation 5. But thus far, from what we've seen of the Xbox Series X, it is a monster. Let's not discount what I've mentioned a few times here. 4K, 60 frames a second, up to 120 frames per second, AAA titles for what's probably going to be $500, maximum $600, and it will be impossible, virtually impossible, to build a new PC from scratch to meet those specs. Very interesting. Microsoft has cranked up the knob here when it comes to console gaming, but also PC gaming. It's going to be interesting now. A reminder, a lot of games are compatible on Xbox. A lot of games are compatible with mouse and keyboard. It's a Microsoft system after all. There were games for the PlayStation 2 even, Sony, PlayStation 2, that were mouse and keyboard compatible. Resident Evil 4, I believe, is the first thing that comes to my mind. PlayStation 2, Resident Evil 4 could be played with a mouse and keyboard. Gaming's going to get interesting. The landscaping for gaming is going to get interesting. Now it's going to be people who have relatively powerful PCs saying that they can't play at the same resolution and frame rate as a $500 or possibly $600 console. That's cool. Overall, I think the end result is that we all win in this. It's not. There's no one going to be a loser in this scenario. It's just that gaming has become so great and so accessible that somebody who only has $5 to spend on a new gaming rig can now seriously look at an Xbox Series X and be just as visually pleased as a PC Master Race gamer is. Very cool. What a time to be alive. Thank you for listening to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. I hope you are using this time of self-quarantine and social distancing to rekindle. Now is the best excuse ever. Please don't come out on the other side of this quarantine situation and this coronavirus situation, whether you agree with how we're reacting to it or not. Don't come out on the other side of this with all this extra free time now, depending on who you are. I know there's a lot of kids home from school, but the point is we can't go out to concerts much anymore, movies, restaurants. We're kind of restricted in our social gatherings and the size of social gatherings. There is going, no matter how you slice it, there's going to be more time now that we can devote to rekindling our hobbies, learning new hobbies, rekindling old geek things. So don't come out on the other side of the coronavirus without having added to your skill set, so to speak, without having reinvigorated a fire or a passion for your own geek thing. Use this as an opportunity to reinvest in you. That's a really good way to put it. Use this opportunity, if you can, to reinvest in you. I know a lot of people, waiters and bartenders, aren't going to be working right now, so they're not going to be, money's going to be tight. And what do you do when money's tight? You don't spend the money. You reinvest that time and effort, hopefully, into yourself. So let's use that time to reinvest that time, effort, and energy that we would be working, or if we need to save money, kind of rethink how we're going to entertain ourselves. I think a lot of people are going to get tired of social media through this. I think they're going to be home and they're going to, I don't know, it's going to be interesting to see how we come out of the other side of this. Ultimately, I know we're going to be just fine. We will definitely be just fine on the other end of this. Don't give in to all the doom and gloom. We're going to be okay. Anyways, like I said, thank you for listening to Geek Therapy Radio Podcast. Know that you are worthy of love, both giving and receiving love. Know that you are worthy of your own self-respect. Thank you, thank you, thank you to all my patrons out there. Thank you so much for sharing Geek Therapy Radio with your friends. I love you all for it. I can't wait to talk to you in the next one. Have a great day, everybody.